of the Sunday school building to the main floor? How many of you took the elevator this morning? All right, hands way up. All right, you guys all acted in faith. Okay? You acted in faith. Now, this wasn't an evidence-less faith. It was a faith in accordance with evidence. But you expressed trust in the people who made the elevator and in the people who have repaired the elevator and inspected the elevator. Incidentally, the last one of those, I think, was actually Robert Shawneke. So you're expressing trust indirectly in Robert Shawneke if you took the elevator this morning. Some of you are now thinking, man, I made a bad decision this morning. Okay? Now, what do we mean by that? Well, there's good reason to trust the elevator. Right? The people that made it, we assume, are engineers. The people that installed it are engineers and architects and builders. And so there's good evidence supporting it. And, you know, I saw Glenda get off of it, no problem, so I should be able to as well. But notice you can't know for certain the elevator is going to take you where you want to go, right? Every once in a while, elevators don't work the way they're supposed to. Some of them get demons in the system, and some of them just have a rope that breaks and you plummet to your death. Fortunately, in our building, it's not very far to go. Right? But still, we know that these things happen, yet all of us get on elevators. We express our trust in that way. Fair? Now, a couple of years ago, Glenn and Emily exercised faith. Okay? 3 years now you've been married? About 3? Okay. On the day that you say, I do, you are expressing faith. Faith in the person whom you are marrying. Okay? You make these vows. Do you promise to be her lawfully wedded husband through sickness and health and riches and poorness and all this other stuff and blah, 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 right? And then you say, I do, right? And you trust that the other person, A, believes what they're saying, because, you know, sometimes people lie. So you trust that they actually believe what they're saying, and secondly, you trust that they are going to be faithful to those vows. Can you be sure of that? No. And so you exercise trust when you get married. Okay? So this is the nature of faith. It's believing in accordance with evidence, but then taking a step farther than where the evidence can lead you. If we did not exercise faith, nobody would ever get married. Nobody would ever get on an elevator. Nobody would ever get behind the wheel of a vehicle. Nobody would ever get a pneumonia vaccine. Nobody would ever get a shot for chicken pox. Nobody would ever get on an airplane. Okay? Without faith, you actually can't do anything at all. Biblical faith is trusting the evidence that we see, both in nature and in Scripture, taking that evidence and saying, yes, I believe and I will commit my life to this. It's not believing what we know ain't so. And it's not believing in the absence of evidence. Okay, it's believing in accordance with the evidence that we have and being willing to trust ourselves to the one who calls us to faith. Okay? One of the things that means is that everybody in the world has faith of some sort in something or somebody. Okay? We know in whom we have faith. And so we would say that our faith is well-grounded, okay? So anyway, that's just one important thing, I think, to set out at the beginning. To understand what Dawkins means by faith is not what traditional Christians mean by faith, okay? With that, I read the beginning of Romans chapter, well, not the beginning, but I read from Romans chapter 1 to lay out what is called natural theology, okay? Paul says that what we can know about God is plain to us, and it is plain to us because God has made it plain to us. And Paul says, verse 20, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. In other words, we can look around us at what God has made. We can look around us at nature. We can look, incidentally, at human nature. And we can understand from what God has made that God is, that God exists. Okay? Now, with that, moving down to Roman numeral 2, okay, what we call here classical theistic arguments. what do we mean by a theistic argument? In the medieval period, these were called theistic proofs. Okay? We don't call them that anymore because proof has taken on kind of a technical connotation of like a mathematical proof, where, you know, if 2 plus 2 equals 4, and if 2 plus 2 equals 4, then 4 plus 4 equals 8, right? And this is like a mathematical proof. That's not what we mean by theistic proofs, because a mathematical proof, there is no possibility whatsoever that the conclusion could be mistaken, right? When we talk about theistic arguments, we're not constructing arguments of that sort. We're constructing arguments that actually could be mistaken. The conclusion might actually be wrong, okay? And so they are arguments, not proofs. So with that, and this is probably the only really tough part of well, never mind. This is probably the toughest part of the chapter, is looking at the nature of philosophical arguments. What is an argument? Now, some of you think of an argument as what your family does at Thanksgiving. That's not what we're talking about either, okay? A philosophical argument is setting forth evidence and reasons to support a particular conclusion. And so a theistic argument is trying to lay out premises that support a particular conclusion. Okay? Now, I'm not going to walk through all of the things. Well, actually, I do have it there at the bottom of that first page. Okay, the nature of a sound argument, that is a good argument. That's what a good argument looks like. It has valid form and true premises. Okay? I won't walk through all of that just because it's kind of dense. But if you want to talk about it after, I'll stay. Well, we can talk through business meeting. How's that? All right. So a theistic argument is structured such that there are premises, and we're assuming that we can establish the truthfulness of these premises, or these premises are much more likely to be true than not true, and the premises are linked together in such a way that they establish their conclusion. All right, so we give a couple of examples of just simple arguments in chapter 4, okay? So there's an argument, here's one example I think that we use, right? If it is raining outside, then the driveway will be wet. That's the first premise. Premise 2, anybody remember? It is raining outside. Now, if those two premises are true, then what conclusion follows from those? The driveway will be wet, okay? So if those premises are both true, then the conclusion will follow with necessity. That, in short, is what we're looking to do with theistic arguments, is set forth premises that we can establish that, yeah, you know, this premise is true. I think it's true. You think it's true. This premise we think is true. And these premises together would establish this conclusion. And oh, guess what? The conclusion is, yeah, God exists. Sorry. You might not have seen that one coming, right? So we're trying to establish through these arguments that it is more reasonable than not to believe that God exists, okay? So tonight we were looking just at one particular type of theistic argument, okay? And that's cosmological arguments. There are all sorts of families of theistic arguments. There are cosmological arguments. We're going to talk about that tonight. But there are teleological or design arguments, so like arguments from fine-tuning, which are really, really fun, incidentally. Okay, that's what we'll look at next week. There are also moral arguments, arguments from the nature of morality to the existence of God. Ontological arguments, those ones make your brain hurt. Anthropological arguments, arguments looking at human nature. What about human nature points towards God? Some of those are like arguments from reason, the fact that we actually have rational capacities. What does that tell us about God? Arguments from religious desire, religious experience. Arguments from beauty. One of my favorite theistic arguments goes like this. Johann Sebastian Bach, therefore God exists. And then it's got a PS. Either you get it or you don't, right? But it's just kind of a cheeky argument that's like... Anyways, we won't. These are other families of theistic arguments, okay? So we're not going to talk about all of them in our time together, but we are going to look at a few of these families over the next several weeks. Within each of those families, there are then all sorts of different individual theistic arguments that exist. So just say you might have a family, and there's lots of individual members of your family, so too cosmological arguments are a family, and there are all sorts of individual arguments within them. Okay, so you can multiply theistic arguments. Nobody's counted, but you could probably construct thousands of them with the different variations within each family. There's going to be lots of similarities to arguments within families, but there's going to be nuanced differences between them as well, okay? So one of the arguments that I give in chapter 4 is from Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century philosopher, and it's an argument from causation that I think is fun in chapter 4. But I wasn't going to spend our time tonight looking at that one. Instead, we were going to look at the Kalam Cosmological Argument, which is actually even older than Aquinas is, right? So Aquinas is writing in the 13th century. The Kalam argument originates in about the 10th century. And it originates with actually a Muslim philosopher who uses it as a proof for the existence of a monotheistic, all-powerful God, okay? And so do we have the video just about ready to run? So we got a short, about 4-minute video that I want to show you. This is an animated version of the argument that I have in this chapter, okay? So it's going to do a better job than me in explaining it.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, 3 leading cosmologists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
Okay, so again, that's a really good, short, animated video. There's actually a series of those from Reasonable Faith is the ministry that puts those together for various theistic arguments. We might see one or two more before we're done together. But it does a good job of laying out the basics, okay? So again, the structure of the argument is fairly simple. Everything that begins to exist has an external cause, okay? And again, this is established kind of in